Welcome to this New York Times Opinion Hangout. I'm Kristof, a columnist for the New York Times, and this is a new initiative for our opinion department. We are experimenting with using Google Hangout as a way of engaging with what we used to call readers. Now you're viewers, you're part of the New York Times family in all kinds of ways. And here's how this is going to work. We sent out a call a while back for people to join us in this conversation about global issues. Our first problem was that we had hundreds of responses of people who wanted to participate. We winnowed that down to a terrific group of 5 people who I'll introduce you to in a moment, from all over the world, including one joining us from Afghanistan in the middle of the night. And over the next half hour, we're going to have a very lively conversation about global affairs. So let me first introduce the person in the hot seat today, Susan Rice, the United States Ambassador to the United Nations. Hi, Susan.
Hey, Nick. Good to be with you.
It's great to have you here. Susan Rice was, she's a pioneer in the use of social media as well, and her Ambassador Rice Twitter handle is constantly active. So it's good to take this to a new form in social media. And now I'd like to introduce members of our Google Plus panel. First of all, let me introduce James Correa. James, can you just maybe say where you are and what you do?
Hi, Nick. Thanks. Yeah, I'm a captain in the United States Army. I'm currently tuning in from Sharana, Afghanistan. That's in Paktika on the border. And as you mentioned before, it's the middle of the night here.
Well, thanks for staying up to join us, and we'll hope that that power holds out. You're in in a rough neighborhood in Afghanistan, in Paktika, and we really appreciate it. Maria Chiquen, tell us
Hi,
about
Nick.
yourself.
Hi, my name is Maria Chiquen, and I am a high school junior from Miami, Florida.
Terrific. Well, you bring down our average age a little bit, Maria. Catherine Lewanson.
Hi, Nick. Hi, Ambassador Rice. It's a pleasure. I am tuning in from New York City. I'm an attorney and a mom of 2 young daughters.
Okay. Are those daughters in the background? Are they going to ask a question or two as well?
Maybe in the future.
Okay. And Joshua Thorpe.
Yes, hello. I'm coming from Ashland, Oregon. I'm a grad student studying international business focused on East Asia. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Joshua. And finally, Michael Hilke.
Hi, Nick, and hi, Dr. Rice. I'm Michael, and I'm a physicist in Montreal.
Terrific. Well, thanks to all of you. And Ambassador Rice, let me have the moderator's prerogative and toss out a first question about the Middle East. I think a lot of us have been watching the tragedy unfolding in Syria, and also what is unfolding in Bahrain as well. And I think we're getting the feeling that the U.S., that the Obama administration has been very outspoken in the case of Syria, but not very effective in terms of actually bringing about an amelioration of the situation there. And conversely, in Bahrain, we seem to have been quiet publicly, but also not hugely effective. Now, I'm sure you have a different take, so tell us about them.
Well, let me begin by saying again, thank you, Nick, for inviting me and for doing this, and thanks to all of the participants for joining and being guinea pigs in this experiment, which I hope will be successful and therefore replicated. But let me talk a bit about the question you asked, and let me start with Syria. Nick, we're all across the world, and particularly in the United States, horrified by the violence in Syria. And our policy objectives are quite clear. We want to see the end of the Assad regime as swiftly as possible and a transition to a democratic dispensation for the people of Syria so that those who have been denied their rights for so long and who have been brutalized by this violence have the opportunity to chart their own future. Go into discussion with you and others about what makes Syria different from other circumstances in the region, from Egypt, from Yemen, from Libya, from Bahrain. Each of these are somewhat different, but in all of these instances we have been consistent about our support for the adherence to certain universal values: the right for people to protest peacefully, decide their own future, associate with whom they want. In the specific case of Syria, in order to try to mount pressure on the Assad regime to accelerate the day when it is compelled to depart, we've been doing several things in parallel. First of all, we have imposed, going back to almost a year ago, tough U.S.-based economic sanctions on the Assad regime. We've been joined by the European Union, now just this week imposed their 15th round of sanctions on Assad and his cronies, freezing their assets, freezing the assets of the central bank, and many other steps. And as a consequence of these measures by the U.S. and the European Union, and also some countries in the neighborhood of Syria, the economic pressure has been brought to quite a severe state. The impact on the currency of Syria has been significant, on their foreign reserves significant, and so the economic noose is tightening, and we're going to continue to tighten it in every way we can. Secondly, we've provided active political and material support to the Syrian opposition. That political support is trying to help them cohere and form a platform and become more unified. The material support includes non-lethal aid to the peaceful opposition, and that aid includes medical supplies, communications equipment, and a great deal more, and we are ramping up the quantity and the quality of that assistance. We've provided humanitarian aid to help the people who are suffering so much. We've put in place mechanisms to try to enable accountability for war crimes that Assad has committed, and we have done all of this while trying to mount significant international pressure. We've been thwarted, as you know, by the fact that the Russians and the Chinese have twice used the Council to block more concerted international pressure on the Assad regime. We've been able to come together around this effort by Kofi Annan, his six-point plan, which we support because it would yield a political transition where Assad would have to go and the people would be able to determine their own future. And that's entailed putting unarmed UN observers on the ground in Syria. There are now about 236. The goal is to get to 300 within the end of the month. And their aim is to observe and report on the violence and deter the violence by their presence.
If I can, so we're doing that. We're tightening the leash on Syria, but at the same time, in the case of the other repressive regime in the region, Bahrain, we're actually selling them weapons. Isn't there an inconsistency there?
As I said, each of these are different circumstances. Let's talk about Bahrain. In Bahrain, we've been very clear that the violence, the peaceful protesters need to be able to organize and protest peacefully, that any violence against them is completely unacceptable. We're calling upon the opposition to maintain a peaceful approach and refrain from escalating violence. We've supported the Independent Commission of Inquiry that has been quite frank in assessing what went wrong, and now those recommendations need to be implemented. Now let me explain. We did announce over the course of the last week a change in our posture, and back in the fall we put a pause on all military assistance to Bahrain. Bahrain, as you know, is an important ally and partner in the Gulf region. It's a neighbor of Iran. It's in a very rough neighborhood, and we have a substantial American naval presence there. This week we decided to resume a portion of our military assistance, that only which is usable for Bahrain to defend itself from external threats. Anything for the Ministry of Interior, any small arms, any tow weapons, anything that could be used against people inside of Bahrain or against peaceful protesters remains on hold. So given this nature going on in the region, given the importance of Bahrain and the threats it faces, we thought it was time to begin resume that they need to defend itself against external threats.
Thanks. And now let's go on to another hot spot. James, here's your chance to ask a question.
Thanks, Nick. Ma'am, my question's about Afghanistan and governance. Recently, Afghanistan was found to have large mineral deposits. Yet when I look at the example of Sudan and the large or significant oil investment there, I don't see necessarily an improvement to human rights or to quality of life. As we draw down forces here in Afghanistan, which I'll be a part of hopefully in the next month, how do we help discourage the corruption and promote transparency with our Afghan partners?
Well, thank you for your question, but more importantly, James, thank you for your service to our country and to the important business that we are doing on behalf of the American people in Afghanistan. You ask a very important question, one that's specific to Afghanistan, but it gets to a larger question about how do you promote good governance in fragile countries where they have abundant natural resources and they're often not used for the benefit of the people. In the case of Afghanistan, as you know, those natural resources, those mineral resources, are just beginning to be discovered and exploited. And it is very important for the future of the people of Afghanistan that a government that has struggled mightily, as you well know, with corruption, shepherds and marshals those resources in a way that will benefit the people, who remain exceedingly poor. We have spent a lot of effort, not just on the military side and the that you and our servicemen and women are making to enhance security and to create an environment in which development can begin, but our partners from the U.S. Agency for International Development, the State Department, and many others very much involved in helping Afghanistan develop its economy and build the capacity. And one of the most important things we've done, including with the international financial institutions, is to try to help rein in corruption and to make it clear that the international community's resources are not unconditional, like the IMF resource, that they are dependent on cleaning up the banks, cleaning up other instances of corruption. Now, other countries, Sudan is not an example, but Botswana, for example, is a good example of a country that has abundant natural resources. Botswana has diamonds, but has put in place transparency regimes and good governance that prove it doesn't have to be the so-called first. And so the international community, the United States, as an ongoing partner of Afghanistan, is going to have to continue to put pressure and indeed provide support so that the government there is compelled to utilize those resources more responsibly and to make sure that they actually redound to the benefit of the Afghan people.
Thanks. Now, Maria, let's turn to you. You're the youth representative on this panel here. What's on your mind for the ambassador?
Thank you. My question pertains to U.S. policy towards Cuba, my native country. I arrived to the United States when I was 6 years old, and since then I've traveled many times to Cuba. The U.S. government continues to refuse lifting the embargo on Cuba. And the excuse is that it's on behalf of the national interest and because of human rights violation by the Cuban government. However, we maintain strong commercial relations with other countries such as China with similar conditions, such as various human rights violations. Polls have shown that practically no one beyond the small Cuban-American Republican lobby supports the embargo. And my question is this special interest group in the swing state of Florida the real justification for the embargo? And does this mean that relations with Cuba are being treated as a domestic as opposed to a foreign policy issue?
Well, thank you very much, Maria, for that question. And let me tell you how President Obama views our relationship with Cuba. He's made very clear from the very beginning of his administration that the United States wants a new relationship with Cuba. We want to use a phrase you've heard before, turn the page in our relationship with Cuba. And to that end, we have been very clear that we expect and will insist on respect for human rights and the dignity of the Cuban people. But at the same time, President Obama has taken important steps to open up channels to the people of Cuba by allowing unlimited family visits, which is new, allowing the free flow of remittances back to the people of Cuba and more people-to-people exchanges. Unfortunately, the Cuban regime has given no indication that it wants to reciprocate, that it either wants to have a better relationship with the United States or make fundamental changes in the nature of government. So in a sense, we've extended a hand, and the hand has not been taken by the Castro regime. Now, we look forward to the day when change comes to Cuba. It will inevitably. It's not that we're going to have, changes in places like the Middle East and it will never come to Cuba. It will. I gave a speech on the weekend at the University of Miami at their commencement, and I spoke about this universal yearning for freedom that it cannot be suppressed. And the same is true with respect to Cuba. So we're looking now to the Cuban government to show that it wants a different relationship with the United States, and we remain open to pursuing that when the time is right.
Thank you.
Catherine, you're up. Why don't you offer your question for the ambassador?
Hi, Ambassador Rice. My question involves U.S.-China relations. Currently, China is building up its military to exert control over the South China Seas, as evident with China having to stop processing visas to the Philippines. I'm Chinese American. I'm married to a Filipino American. My husband actually was born in the Philippines. I'm wondering, what is the U.S. going to do to protect its interests and those of the neighboring countries surrounding the South China Seas?
Well, the United States, first of all, has very strong relationships and alliances throughout the Asia-Pacific region, including, of course, with the Philippines. And President Obama has made clear that the 21st century, from the American point of view, will be increasingly an Asian century. And we have devoted additional diplomatic, military, and economic resources to our presence in the region and to relationships with key countries in the region. China is a major player, obviously, and a country that we work with to the extent we can, including at the United Nations. But we've made very clear that freedom of navigation, the international waterways need to be respected, that we will stand for those principles and stand with our partners in the region as they defend themselves and assert their sovereign legal rights. So that's our broad approach, and I think China understands that. We've communicated it very clearly, including most recently when Secretary Clinton and Secretary Geithner were in China a couple weeks ago for the annual U.S. Strategic and Economic Dialogue, where, of course, these and many other issues came up.
Susan, if I can just follow up on that. I mean, you're dealing with China all the time at the United Nations on global issues. Do you basically see them as a partner on these issues, or as an antagonist, or both, neither?
Sometimes a partner, sometimes we differ. But we work closely with China, particularly as a permanent member, fellow permanent member of the Security Council, on some issues like North Korea, and we have of late been able to work in tandem to policies that we think are in our mutual interest and mutually beneficial. So, for example, when North Korea most recently in April launched its so-called satellite, which was a blatant violation of U.S. Security Council resolutions and illegal, the United States and China negotiated a very strong statement of the Security Council which condemned it and which imposed additional sanctions on North Korea, and that we worked together on the previous sanctions on North Korea quite effectively. On Sudan, where we haven't always agreed, as you well know, Nick, and they've been closer to the government in Khartoum. We, of course, have been closer to the government in South Sudan and in Juba. But they're on the brink of, if not over the brink, in terms of outright conflict between Sudan and South Sudan. And the U.S. and China, South Africa, and other partners in the Security Council, Russia and France, worked together a couple weeks ago to pass a very strong Security Council resolution that put in place binding demands on both sides and threatened both sides with sanctions if they fail to meet those demands and pull back their forces from the border and don't get back to the negotiating table. So those are examples where we've worked well. There's another one. There are instances where we disagree, and when and Syria is a classic recent example where we had the Russian and Chinese double vetoes until we were able to deploy this monitoring force. So it's a mixed bag. But with the Chinese, they're straightforward. We negotiate, we differ, we agree, and what you see is what you get.
And just very, very briefly, when the U.S. does raise human rights issues, as, for example, when the dissident Chen Guangcheng was recently housed, protected in the U.S. Embassy, just very briefly, do we pay a price in terms of diplomatic partnership? Are they less willing to work with us on these other kinds of issues?
I don't think we raise these issues because they matter to our principles and our values, and we raise them without regard for whether or not they may take offense or. But actually, I think as a practical, they're very pragmatic. They may not like what we say, and they may not want to hear what we have to say on issues of human rights in every instance. But we're dealing with each other every day in the Security Council on a much more sort of practical level that I think is quite separate from irritation they may have on other human rights issues or other issues in the bilateral relationship.
Thanks. Now, Joshua, what's on your mind in Ashland, Oregon?
Yes, well, Ambassador Rice, my question actually follows very closely with what you were talking about with China and partnering with them, specifically related to their influence and economic ties to Iran. I'm wondering, have you seen any indications that they are becoming more willing to use that influence to encourage Iran to become more constructive with a dialogue, to forego their attempts at developing nuclear weapons? And will that influence that China has with Iran be effective toward that end?
Thank you. That's a very important and actually very timely question, Joshua. Let me go back a couple years. When the United States successfully got the Security Council in June of 2010 passed Security Council Resolution 1929, we imposed some exceedingly tough sanctions on Iran. And we were able to do so after months and months of painstaking diplomacy, including sustained efforts by President Obama with the Chinese and the Russians to get their agreement to that resolution. And they stuck with that. They voted for it, and they've implemented it. We've now layered additional sanctions on that, national, EU, other, and the sanctions have now sort of reached a point where by this summer, they are going to really hit their high water mark, and there'll be a ban on the import of Iranian oil by the European Union. There will be a widespread ban on dealings with the Central Bank of Iran, and some of the sanctions that our own Congress has passed will kick in and penalize countries that don't reduce their import of Iranian oil. Chinese know that. We're in dialogue with them every day. How they choose to calibrate the level of their oil imports will be very influential in determining how they fare in relation to U.S. legislation. But at the meantime, we're sitting down in what we call the P5+1, the permanent members of the Security Council, 5+, including China, Russia, UK, France, +1 is Germany, at the negotiating table with the Iranians. They've come to the negotiating table, the Iranians, for the first time year because the economic pressure has reached a really painful level. And we're coordinated with China. We have a position, and we hope that when the second round of negotiations happen next week, that Iran will come to the table with a greater measure of seriousness than they have in past years. But China's unified voice in that P5+1 context is very important, and it's one of the reasons why we continue to use that vehicle for dealing with Iran.
Thank you.
Thanks. Michael, why don't you ask your question, please?
Thanks, Nick. Dr. Rice, so as a physicist, we understand the world in terms of sort of underlying principles and equations. And so if I apply that now to foreign policy, in order to better understand sort of the position of the administration, of the current administration, I can try to think of policy in terms of maximizing outcomes. But then in order to do that, I have to sort of rank the different possible outcomes I want to maximize. For example, do I want to enhance liberty? Do I want to enhance security? Do I want to enhance power? Do I want to enhance human rights? So what is the the position of the administration in order to decide what is the priority of the administration in terms of these desired outcomes? Can you sort of rank these desired outcomes in a sort of simple and underlying principled way?
I knew there was a good
If you want to
reason
write
why
a formula, if you want to write a formula of American foreign policy and post it,
knew there was a good reason why I did statistics. I didn't understand it then, and I'm not sure I would now. But I do get your question, and I appreciate what you're asking. The fact is, Professor, that it is possible to apply a single algorithm or a single equation to any broad swath of foreign policy problems. One of the challenges in formulating and implementing national security and foreign policy is that each situation is different. Each place is different, and they're different at different points in time. And we have a broad set of interests, obviously, and I'll talk about them, but we don't have the luxury of saying that they be applied in a sort of formulaic way in every circumstance at any different point in time. Obviously, the United States has an abiding interest in peace and security for the American people, for our allies and our homeland. We have an abiding interest in democracy and respect for human rights. We have an abiding interest in collective action that can only be applied to address certain global problems. There's some huge problems that we deal with, climate change, for example, or internationalism, or weapons of mass destruction, or flows of crimes and drugs, or challenges of poverty and underdevelopment that can't be dealt with by any one country in isolation, even one as powerful as the United States of America. So we need other countries to be, to the greatest extent possible, on board and making their contributions to a collective effort to tackle these transnational or global challenges. So that's another interest. We have a range of interests. And depending on the nature of the problem and what's at stake and what else is going on at the same time, we have to to the problem. So our tools may be diplomatic, they may be economic, they may be military, they may be all the above or something different. And we can't just say interest number one is always this, interest number two is always that, and plug in the numbers and spit out the answer. It's as you know very well, I think it's much more complex and nuanced than that.
Let me ask maybe sort of a follow-up to that as it relates to Sudan, which is a country you mentioned, I know a country you care a lot about and have worked a lot on both before you joined the administration and since. And I know you've done a lot of really important work there, but it does strike me that, as you know, we have this humanitarian tragedy brewing not only in Darfur now, but also in southern Kordofan and in the Blue Nile. There, peacekeepers and aid workers have been kicked out. Food is running out. Areas are being bombed. During the Bush administration, many members of the Obama administration were urging a no-fly zone, much more forceful, robust measures against Sudan. Well, since taking office, there seems to be less willingness to use really robust, tough measures against Sudan. Is that true? Is that fair?
I think that, we're in a different point in time in 2012 than we were in 2008 or we were in 2004 when the genocide in Darfur was underway in full strength. And we, again, as I said to Mike, we have to adapt our tools and approaches to the circumstances of the moment. We're also engaged in other parts of the world simultaneously. But let me say this. We have a more complicated situation in some ways. We have an ongoing humanitarian crisis in Darfur, but it's at a different level than it was some years ago. We have both the same problem we had, government bombardments, Janjaweed raids, the victimization of people in displaced persons camps, refugees, as you and I know well, both having been there. But it is as much now violence that is being perpetrated by a proliferation of rebel and criminal organizations as it is by the government. and it is more of the character of an ongoing civil conflict than a one-sided slaughter or genocide. Now, what's different from, say, some years ago is that there is now the world's largest peacekeeping force, United Nations African Union peacekeeping force on the ground in Darfur. There is a robust humanitarian presence. And the combination of those two things has made the situation less threatening, although by no means not threatening to civilians. So there is some prophylactic protection and there is some humanitarian access in that piece. Now the next piece, which wasn't such a hot problem a couple years ago, but it has again become one, as you well know, Nick, because you've been there, is what's going on in southern Kordofan and Blue Nile, where there's an ongoing rebellion against Khartoum. Khartoum's responding with the same barbaric tactics that it's used before, like aerial bombardments and artillery fire. But the most pressing concern, as you know, is a humanitarian one. There are people there who are going to be starving in very large numbers in the near term. So there, the response we've tried to take is how do we get access to the people who need the humanitarian assistance most urgently. We've wanted to accomplish that, and the whole international community has been behind a plan to accomplish that by what they call this tripartite proposal, where the African Union, the UN, and the League of Arab States basically monitor the provision of humanitarian assistance that would go to people in rebel-held areas of southern Kordofan. Khartoum has continuously refused that. The rebels have accepted it. And as a consequence, that hasn't gone anywhere. That would be the best way to help folks there. Instead, we have had to look at other means of getting assistance in to the people of southern Kordofan. And the United States is doing that, and we're going to continue to do that. But it's not the optimum way, and it's not the fastest and swiftest way to reach those people in need. And then you also have a newly independent South Sudan with its own internal problems, with a border problem with the north, and belligerent actions that have been taken by both sides. And I mentioned earlier what we've done to try to address that. They're both wrong. They're both behaving in a destabilizing fashion, and the message has been to them to stop. Now, thankfully, the South pulled its forces out of Heglig inside of Sudan. They've pulled their forces and security forces out of Abyei. The North seems to, at least over the last week to 10 days, stop the bombing into South Sudan. So we may be at the beginning of some progress in the North-South conflict, but it's too soon to say so, and they need to get back to the negotiating. We have all of these different things at work simultaneously, and we have to address them in tandem. We don't have the luxury of focusing only on Darfur and forgetting North-South, or focusing only on Blue Nile and Nuba and forgetting the rest. So we have to juggle, in fact, all of these challenges simultaneously and try to go back to Mike's point, maximize the outcomes.
Thanks. And I'd like to open this up to a little bit of a discussion among our panelists. If you have another follow-up question you'd like to ask, James, since you're from the farthest away, you get first crack at it.
And somebody ought to ask Nick a question. He's such an authority. Yeah, come on. How often do they get to talk to you either?
Or maybe I'll save that one for the commentary on the New York Times website. Ma'am, I have one question. I read recently that Pakistan will be coming to the table for the NATO summit in Chicago, coming here in the near future. Other than some of the fuel issues we've had bringing fuel into this country, they haven't had my favorite potato chips in the cafeteria. What would be the optimal walk away for the United States from the NATO summit with Pakistan independence?
Well, as you know, there's been some question about whether Pakistan would and should attend. I think it's a good thing that they will be there, and I hope that we will have reached a way forward on these ground lines of communication. The Pakistan's willingness to allow NATO to continue to transit goods in and out of Afghanistan that you all rely on through Pakistani territory. But the purpose of the NATO summit, though, the main purpose with respect to Afghanistan is obviously much broader. It is a point at which the NATO allies will agree and reaffirm their commitment to an end to all combat operations and the transfer of responsibility for security from NATO forces to Afghan security forces by the end of 2014. They will also discuss a transition point in 2013, next year, when primary responsibility for combat operations will shift to the Afghan security forces, as has begun to, as you know, in many provinces and districts throughout Afghanistan. It will also for the NATO partners to commit to provide materials, money, and training for the Afghan National Security Forces beyond 2014, which is going to be very important. We just signed, as you know, a strategic partnership agreement with Afghanistan that makes clear that when our combat mission is over in 2014 and our combat forces are withdrawn, that we're not abandoning Afghanistan. Our partnership, political, economic, security will continue. And we're very interested that NATO partners be part of that larger process. And obviously with Pakistan in attendance, we hope it'll be possible to continue the discussion about Afghan-led reconciliation efforts, and which is another important part of the overall strategy.
We had a number of questions from people about how they can join the Foreign Service, or, in a sense, get your job, Susan. I think Maria has a question along those lines. Maria?
Yes. My question is, what does the United Nations or even the New York Times have in mind to basically engage the younger population more in regards to global affairs? Because I feel that a lot of young students like myself have been struggling to find ways to contact with ambassadors or even people of high authorities that can't offer them more information and even just more exposure to other things that we usually wouldn't have the access to. So do you guys have any plans for the younger populations, like students and the such?
Let me answer that question on two levels. First of all, what you all can do and should do, and then what we might be able to do in the United States and at the United Nations. First of all, I think that, as I said at the University of Miami last weekend, your generation that's graduating from college is really the first truly global generation, with media and technology, things like this, linking us all up from the corners of Afghanistan to downtown New York City. We can all communicate and coordinate. And this kind of ability has fueled much of the Arab Spring transitions that we've seen young people spark in many parts of the Arab world. So you all are an empowered generation. You have so much that you can bring to bear, and we need you to do so. But for Americans, I think it's really important for young people to get out and travel, to learn languages, to live in other parts of the world. And they know our culture so much better than we know theirs. And if we don't rectify that, it's going to put us in all kinds of competitive disadvantages. So in a narrow economic sense, or even a security sense, but we will not have the ability to lead and to grow as effectively unless your generation is as global as your world. So I think you guys should look at things like the Peace Corps, joining the Foreign Service, the Civil Service, the military. There are many, many different ways to serve. Teach for America, teach the next generation, which is a hugely important calling, but get out and learn this world and bring that knowledge and experience back home. And I encourage you into things like Model UN or whatever kinds of activities that interest you and get you engaged. What we can do on our side, first of all, at the U.S. mission to the United Nations, we really have tried to prioritize bringing young people in to the workings of the United Nations, into the Security Council itself. The United States chaired the Security Council most recently during the month of April, last month. And every time we had an open session, we had outreach to high schools and colleges in the New York area and beyond, and invited young people to join in and listen to those sessions. And then I had the opportunity one afternoon to sit down and basically do a press conference with young journalists in high school and college from all over the area. And the last time the United States had the Security Council presidency, before that in 2010, we brought in hundreds of students from around the world, from all the different countries that were serving on the Security Council at that point. And my council colleagues and I met with them for 2 hours and had an ongoing dialogue, and the Secretary General of the United Nations was there to participate. And the real question was, what do the young look to the Security Council to accomplish for them? What are the issues that are most concerned to the kids of the world? I mean, I'm a mom, as is Catherine. My kids are a little bit older, 14 and 9. But I feel every day that what we're doing is for the next generation. That's what motivates me in the morning. And even when particularly frustrating, knowing that the decisions we make or don't make will have an impact on the lives of my kids and their counterparts and the next generation. So I think we have every interest in more and more young people engaging at the UN. And if you all have ideas on how we can do more and better, please let me know.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much to all of you. I'm afraid we're out of time, but I really appreciate this all around. And I also want to say to the viewers that this has been something of an experiment, and we'd love to get your feedback about how we can make this kind of process better, what would work better. You can leave those comments on my blog, where this will also be archived. That's nytimes.com/ontheground. This will also be archived on Google Plus on the New York Times account. And with that, I would just like to thank our super panel from all over the world. And Secretary and Ambassador Rice, thank you so much for joining us and answering these questions across a huge range of issues.
Thank you so much, Nick, and thanks to all of you for participating. This is a lot of fun, and we'd love to hear from you on Twitter at @Ambassador Rice.
Thanks so much to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
Very much.